So when we go back over the evidence, the history says it's there, the neuroanatomy says it's there, and the neuropsychology says it's there, the evidence says it's there. So what does it mean? Well, first of all, if you put emotion back into ADHD, you can start to explain the comorbid disorders that link up with it. Right now, people treat comorbidity if it's just stuff happens. Okay, ADHD kids are 11 times more likely to have oppositional disorder. So are adults. By the way, ODD is an adult diagnosis, not just a childhood diagnosis. And it's as highly persistent as is ADHD. Why would ADHD link up with oppositional disorder, and then with conduct disorder, and then with anxiety, and then with depression? By putting emotional dysregulation into ADHD, you can see those pathways much more clearly. Let me explain them to you. ODD is a pattern of hostile, defiant, aggressive behavior, willfulness to refuse to obey another individual, resistance to authority. As we've said, it is the #1 comorbidity in ADHD. 65 to 84% of ADHD children will have ODD. It's also the most common comorbidity in adults, but clinicians tend not to diagnose it. They think ODD is a kid's disorder rather than an adult's disorder. We need to keep in mind that ODD forms 2 dimensions. Even DSM-5 is finally acknowledging that ODD is not a single dimension of symptoms. And the 2 dimensions are, 4 of the symptoms are emotional, the anger, the hostility, the temper, and 4 of them are social conflict. They take another person to have that symptom. You're refusing, you're defying, you're resisting authority. Now, the reason that we split ODD into 2 dimensions, and why DSM-5 had to do so, is because the 2 dimensions arise from different sources and make different predictions over life, over time. So, the emotional symptoms of ODD come from ADHD or a mood disorder, like bipolar disorder. So there's a biological basis to the emotional component. It's an inherent feature of the person, not of their environment. Something has predisposed this individual to being very emotional. In this case, it's ADHD. It's that executive function we just talked about. You can't self-regulate your normal emotions. The second dimension of ODD is the social conflict dimension. Where does that come from? Learning. Unlike ADHD, half of the variance of oppositional disorder is learned within a family environment. The training is inadvertent. Parents don't mean to be doing it, but they're doing it anyway. So half of ODD's severity has to do with who is raising you and how good or how poorly their parenting is. So disrupted parenting is the source of the second dimension. ADHD is the source of the first dimension. And you put both of those together, you are going to get clinical ODD. To put it another way, if you're diagnosed with ADHD, you are halfway down the road to ODD. All it's going to take is for you to be raised in a particular environment with a parent who can't manage you very well, and you are off to the races, honey. So it takes both the environment interacting with these genetic predispositions toward emotional dysregulation to get that. So we need to understand then that there are 2 dimensions to ODD arising from different causes and making different predictions over time. If you follow these children over 10 years, the emotional dimension predicts the development of depression and anxiety by adolescence, but especially depression. The social conflict dimension of ODD predicts conduct disorder, antisocial behavior, crime, psychopathy, drug use. So these 2 dimensions are not coming from the same sources, nor are they predicting the same risks or outcomes over time. You have to understand both dimensions to know the risks that are carried forward here. And now you know why 25 to 35% of ADHD children get conduct disorder, 25% of them go on to have depression, 25 to 35% get anxiety disorder, and the risk of anxiety disorder increases with age. By adulthood, 45% of adults coming into clinics with ADHD have developed an anxiety disorder with their ADHD. And a lot of that has to do with that emotion dysregulation dimension. They can't cope with emotions as well as other people are able to do. Now, as we've said, ADHD does contribute to ODD, and it is likely through that emotional dimension that it is doing it. But we also know that ADHD predicts ODD through disrupted parenting. And I'm going to explain that little pathway to you in just a moment. But by understanding the role that ADHD plays in generating oppositional disorder, we now can go back 40 years and explain one of the most common findings in drug studies. If you give an ADHD medication to somebody, you improve their ODD as much as their ADHD. Even though they're ADHD drugs, they treat oppositional disorder as much, as effectively as they treat ADHD. The two dimensions are correlated 0.8 with each other. Now, why would these drugs treat ODD? Because part of ODD is ADHD. And if you can get control of the ADHD emotion, you can get control of what's contributing to ODD. But only if you intervene early enough. If this child remains dysregulated long enough within a family of disrupted parenting, there's a learning component that's going to take place. And guess what? If you intervene later at 8, 9, or 10 with your medication, you are not going to get rid of that ODD. You'll only get rid of the part that was linked to the early ADHD. You won't get rid of the part that was due to training. No medication is going to reverse your learning history. So, to put it another way, the longer you let ODD go untreated, the more likely that social component is going to get in there, and then your medication isn't going to resolve the ADHD. This is why we argue for very early intervention with ADHD children. Even the American Academy of Pediatrics revised their guidelines a year ago, telling pediatricians to start at 4 or younger. Get in there, because we're trying to prevent not just impairment, but comorbidity. Because once it gets going, later treatment isn't going to rectify the problem completely as much as it would. Simply put, you could prevent ODD if you intervened early and often enough, but we don't. Average age of medication is 8. That's 4 years this kid has gone from original symptom onset to when he finally gets treated for that learning history to take place. Now, as I've said, the social component of ODD is learned. It's learned from this pattern of parenting. Indiscriminate use of consequences, high rates of expressed emotion, yelling, screaming at each other, making threats, and vacillating between lax discipline, you do nothing even though your child is obnoxious, to harsh discipline. You practically beat the kid to a pulp if he misbehaves. But you're all over the map in your parenting. You are as emotional as your child is in your parenting. Where does disrupted parenting come from? Why are these parents doing this? Well, we found out the answer in the last 10 years. The parent has ADHD too. It's a genetic disorder, hello, right? If the child has it, 35% of the parents carry the same disorder without treatment. And adult ADHD, as we now know, disrupts your parenting dramatically because you're impulsive, you're emotional, you're inconsistent, you don't persist, you can't follow good rules of parenting. You are as emotional as your child. So now I got 2 ADHD people trying to get along with each other, living in the same household. And that sets the training in motion. So notice, the child's ADHD contributes to ODD through the emotion dysregulation. The parent's ADHD contributes to ODD by disrupting their parenting and allowing the child to learn how to use emotions to coerce people out of certain interactions with them. Keep in mind, ODD and defiant behavior is not to get attention. It's negatively reinforced behavior. It is designed to get you to back off. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do homework. I don't want to go to bed. I want to play video games. That is not attention getting. And if I can elevate my anger faster than you, there's a good chance I can get you to back down. And that's what you see here. Is parent and child reinforcing each other's behavior on a partial schedule of success and failure for using anger as a social tool to get along with each other. But we know the reason the parent is doing it, and that's because the parent has a psychological disorder as well, and the most common is adult ADHD, although there are other disorders, depression, drug abuse, and so on, that will do that too. In fact, depression is even worse than adult ADHD at disrupted parenting. Okay, for you people who only have a right hemisphere, let's diagram what I just said. Make it easier for you to understand. This is our oppositional child with ADHD. We're going to split his oppositionality into its two components. Right? Now, where are those components coming from? This is called the four-factor model of oppositional disorder. It is the most tested and proven pathway for oppositional disorder. Factor number one, the child brings to the equation an inherent dysregulation of emotion. Normally, that's ADHD that's doing that, but it could also be bipolar disorder, severe mood dysregulation disorder, depression. All of them bring with it an inherent propensity for emotion, but ADHD is number one in that hit parade. That contributes to the emotional part of the child. That's a given. That comes with the equation, with the turf. We also know the hyperactivity contributes a little bit to the social component. Now we get to factor number two. As we've said, the parent and the parenting behavior, highly disrupted. That is training the social component. You put these two together, you're going to have a defiant child on your hands, and very quickly. By the way, in case you doubt this, studies actually have taken normal children and parents and trained the parents to act this way, and literally within 30 minutes, they can turn a normal child into an oppositional child. So we already know from experimental manipulations that this theory is in fact correct. It isn't just hypothetical. Then we get to factor three. What is driving the inconsistent parenting? The parent has a psychiatric or psychological disorder. And the most common of those is adult ADHD. The second most common is major depression. And these lesser disorders will do it as well, but those are the big two. And they will massively disrupt your parenting, and that is going to lead to training of your child in becoming oppositional. And then there's factor four, which if I gave you time to think about it, you would have come up with on your own. There are background ecological factors that affect both the parent and their parenting. How about marital discord? How about marital violence? How about being married to a partner who also has a psychiatric disorder, like antisocial personality or drug use disorders? What about raising your child in an impoverished environment that is criminogenic? Adults outside the home are likely to be training this child in doing these things, not just people inside the home. So we have a whole social ecology that is making indirect contributions here. So understand this, defiance starts here. These are the two direct pathways. 1 and 2 are the causes. But we have to step back from there and say, what's causing them? And we move back to the indirect causes, which are these two. But let me tell you, once this cycle gets going, it feeds back to make it worse. The worse this kid gets in his oppositionality, the worse that parent gets in their depression, their irritability. And so we have a nice little cycle going here between these two people. And by the way, it also feeds back into the social ecology as well. You have a hurricane here. This is a tornado of reciprocal influences that are cycling back and forth, making each other worse over time. No wonder by the time this kid is 12 years of age, if he has ODD, the odds of him being delinquent conduct disorder are very high, and the odds of you doing anything about it are less than 25%. That is your success rate with an ADHD oppositional conduct disordered youth. The game is over. If you think once-a-week family therapy is going to handle that family, that is a joke. In our study, they were successful only 5% of the time. So the lesson about ODD is either you get in early and you treat this, or you are not going to get a handle on this. The longer the learning environment gets to train the individual, the less likely you are to intervene successfully with that individual.